In my younger days, I would have been more prescriptive. I would have pontificated, but as I grow old, I know, number one, that I do not have monopoly of wisdom. And what I do is to share my thoughts with you and to make suggestions which may not necessarily be true, but they constitute my opinion on the subject at hand. And that is exactly what I intend to do on a subject on which I do not claim expertise. What I have done is to prepare a paper which will be circulated, and I've prepared it in two forms, in the PowerPoint form and in the Word form. I will speak to the paper without reading the paper, and in that way, I believe we'll interact a lot more. And my paper is entitled, The Vision of the Founding Fathers, Looking to the Past to Inform the Future. And I will be alive to the fact that the element of religion is at the heart of the theme that is being interrogated this afternoon. When I was thinking about the paper, the first question that I asked, who are the founding fathers, or who are the founding fathers that the framers and organizers of this conference had in mind? And I was convinced that they must have had in mind some of the key figures that were present in the 1940s and 1950s and 1990s up to 1980s, and indeed up to the 1990s, who participated in the liberation of Africa. But yet, even as I thought so, I was conscious of the fact that when one examines history, particularly the history of the black people, there are a number of individuals who are founding fathers, but are rarely mentioned when we talk about Africa. One of the individuals who came to my mind is a great South African about whom we say very little, Pixley Kaisaka Seme. The South Africans in this assembly will be aware of that great South African who was one of the founders of the African National Congress. And if they care to examine some of his early works, they will also be familiar with one of the greatest speeches ever delivered by an African, delivered at the University of Columbia in the month of April 1906, titled The Regeneration of Africa. Those who have had the privilege and honor of examining that piece of writing acknowledge that Pixley Kaisaka Seme was very conscious of the status of Africa as it was in those days. You will remember that by 1906, Africa had suffered the fate of partition in Berlin, and that it had been partitioned, as we know, amongst the European powers. Prominently, the Germans had their share in West Africa. They had their presence here in Rwanda and Burundi. They were present in what was then Tanganyika. The French were present. The Portuguese were present. The English were present. The Belgians were present. The Spaniards were present. The Arabs were present, although they were not part of the club that partitioned Africa in 1884. And therefore, when he was talking about the whole idea of the regeneration of Africa, the choice of his words, because he was speaking in a foreign tongue, which I am speaking in this afternoon, he was very clear about the words that he chose. He talked about the regeneration of Africa. And when one talks about regeneration, it means that there was an Africa which had a certain level of development, and that had suffered at the hand of the foreigners, and therefore it needed to be regenerated. Those of you who are familiar with the thoughts and works of Senegal's Anta Cheikh Diop will know that Anta Cheikh Diop does recognize that there was indeed an Africa which had certain levels of civilization. In fact, the more romantic historians suggest that when Europe and Europeans were still living in the caves in the western part of Africa, there were organized kingdoms and that there were libraries which rival the largest libraries in Africa today. Indeed, those of you who are students of religion like Professor here will know that people like Augustine of Hippo or Athanasius, some of the early thinkers in religion, were resident in what may today be called the Maghreb. In other words, therefore, when Pixley Kaisa Kaseme was speaking in 1906, and he was talking about the regeneration of Africa, he was telling us that Africa needs to rediscover herself and that Africa needs to move a notch higher in order to find her pride of place amongst the community of nations. It is instructive, therefore, that the works and the ideas of Pixley Kaisa Kaseme were to be picked and developed a little later in time by other great African thinkers, yet one who is seldom mentioned, James Emmons Kwegyir Aggrey of Ghana, normally referred to as Aggrey of Africa. Many of you, particularly the Ghanaians who are here, will remember that James Emmons Kwegyir Aggrey was the first Ghanaian to earn a PhD and one of the early African leaders of the famous Achimota College in Accra, Ghana. And James Emmons Kwegyir Aggrey was indeed very clear in his mind. The story is told of James Emmons Kwegyir Aggrey, which I'll relate to you now that I have more time than was allotted to me. And the story is one that has been told by different people in different ways, but even if I retell it in the manner which offends the original story, my point will still be made. The point is this. He said, and he remembers as a teacher, that at one time there was a poultry farmer. And he says that this poultry farmer could only keep one thing, because when you're a poultry farmer, you only keep chicken. But he remembers that at one time, some of his chicken that he was keeping strayed into the bush. And when they came back home, there was within their ranks another chick which did not look like them. It was the chick of an eagle. And one day, after a passage of time, a naturalist came to the farmer and saw the eagle in all its splendor. And he said, "This is not chicken, this is an eagle." But the farmer said, "I know. It was once an eagle, but it has been fed on chicken feed for too long. It has long lost its chickenhood. It has long lost its eaglehood. It has now acquired chickenhood." And the poultry farmer and the naturalist said, "No, once an eagle, always an eagle, no matter how long you are fed on chicken feed." And the naturalist said, the farmer said, "I want you to demonstrate." And in the evening, he put the chick on his palm and urged it to fly, but it refused to fly. And the story is told, the farmer said, "I told you. It was once an eagle, it was fed on chicken feed, it has lost its eaglehood, it is now a chicken." But then the following day, the naturalist came early in the morning, and as the sun was rising, he put the chick on the palm of his hands and urged it on, and it flew and never came back again. And he said, "I told you, once an eagle, even if you feed it on chicken feed, it will remain an eagle." And he said so animatedly, it is reported, that is who an African is. He could have been fed on chicken feed, but it has never lost its eaglehood. James Emmons Kwegyir Aggrey was underlining the fact that no matter how devastated you are, you will always have that inner self. And I think the person who captured it in order to lay the basis of this as an artist is a man that we call Wole Soyinka. The many of you who are Nigerians here will remember Wole Soyinka's famous writing, "The man died, the man died, the man died, the man in you must never die," and the man includes the woman. And I'm laying this basis for us to understand that when we talk about forefathers, we must never forget individuals such as Pixley Kaisa Kaseme. We must never forget people like James Eman Kwejiragri. We must not forget people like Cheikh Ante Diop. And if we want to go into the diaspora, we must never forget individuals such as Marcus Garvey of Jamaica. And we must never forget individuals such as W.B. Du Bois. And one of the things that they underscored in those early days before I come to the forefathers that we are much more familiar with is that Pixley Kaisa Kaseme, in his writing and his speech, which I've already talked about, he said, in order for Africa to realize our potential amongst the Committee of Nations, there is only one thing that must define African relationship with other civilizations. He called it multi-dimensional osmosis. And what he called multi-dimensional osmosis becomes much more relevant, particularly today, when we are trading with China, when the osmosis is not multi-dimensional. And the osmotic is only in one direction, is monodirectional. And what he meant at that time is that Africans must engage with other civilizations, but that engagement must be of such a nature that it is mutually beneficial and the relationship is symbiotic. And I think that that is what we want to underscore today, even as we talk about religion and the place of religion in giving pride of place to self-governance and religious freedom as an important pillar in one of the 7 pillars of Africa Agenda 2063. But yet I cannot at this stage yet go into Africa Agenda 2063 before I examine what was the vision of our founding fathers and who were they. In my own examination, and I stand to be corrected on this, whenever we talk about the founding fathers of Africa, we are normally directed to remember the 32 leaders who gathered in the month of May 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I encourage us to look at the views of these individuals, but even before we go to that particular period, to look at some of the early thoughts and some of the things that animated these individuals to the extent that we now call them the founding fathers, and what it is that they had in mind that defined them as the founding fathers. And I take us back to 1957 in Accra, Ghana, on the day that the country then known as Gold Coast regained her political independence. And see how deliberate I am. I'm saying the country regained her political independence, did not acquire her independence. She regained an independence that she had lost by dint of force and by dint of both strategy and stratagem. In 1957, on the day of the regaining of the independence by Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was as passionate as he was eloquent. He said that the independence of Ghana meant nothing unless all the other African countries were independent. And what did independence mean? Because at that time, and you will give me a little latitude in order to give some flavor to my presentation. If you look at the individuals who are present at that time in terms of the commonality and the unanimity of their vision, one had to look at Africa and understand what it is that they were talking about. In West Africa, if you listened at that time to Kwame Nkrumah, his clarity of vision is that independence and liberty meant a number of things. One, the liberty of the individual as individuals to exercise their thoughts and to be free to participate in their affairs, including religion as I understand it, and that therefore Kwame was conscious that the country that he had participated in liberating, which was Christian Gold Coast, but he rechristened and the people rechristened Ghana, was a multi-ethnic country and a multi-religious country and a country that was rich in her diversity. And the same was true of every other country. So that if you listened at that time in next door to in Nigeria, which was, as you know, until independence divided into three regions, the northern region, the eastern region, and the western region, you could see that even at that time in Nigeria, while the colonialist was conscious of the religious differences, the leaders of the day, even if grudgingly so, were conscious of the fact that now that they had found themselves in this geographical space, they had to tolerate each other. So that when you are listening to the Muslims in the north, when you are listening to Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in Nigeria, or the Saudaner of Sokoto, Sah Ahmadu Bello, and listening to Namdi Azikiwe, who is a Christian, they are conscious of their diversity. They are grudgingly in Nigeria, but they accept the fact that they must live together. Religion and religious differences was not given the pronouncement and the accent that we now see in the manner that I shall demonstrate when I am concluding my presentation. So that even if you left countries that had that kind of diversity and you went to Algeria and you listened to the more casual thoughts of Algeria's Ahmed Ben Bella, you could see that he was conscious of the fact that even though we were finding ourselves in potential religious conflict, we had a common vision for Africa. And in that regard, you would listen in Liberia, or rather in Algeria, to Ahmed Ben Bella. You would go down to Guinea to Ahmed Sékou Touré. You would go to Egypt to Gamal Abdel Nasser, leading an Egypt that was fundamentally Muslim, but conscious of the fact that there was an Africanness. But there were also other individuals who at that time did not believe that God existed. They were persuaded that there was something called materialism, that they were persuaded by a different ideology. But even in that appreciation, they were conscious of one fact, that there was a continent called Africa, and that Africa was a continent that needed to move in one direction. And you will discover such individuals when you come to Kenya, when you come to Tanzania. We talk about people who are Christians, committed Christians, such as Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And you went down to the people who did not quite believe in Southern Africa, like Agostino Neto or Samora Moses Machel at that time. But what is critical for our presentation is that in May 1963, 32 leaders congregate in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, at the invitation of Emperor Haile Selassie. And I invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to take time this evening or hereafter to read the speeches that were delivered by each one of them. And I've read each one of them several times. Even the ones who later disappointed us, the Spirit was on them. The Spirit was on them. And I will only isolate a few of them in order for us to appreciate how far they could see. As I stand here, I remember the speech of David Dacko of Central African Republic. He says that Africa must unite and move in one direction, for how would a little country such as Central African Republic survive in the face of the sustained machinations of the erstwhile colonial power? We know that David Dacko did not live up to the dreams that we thought he would. I listened to speeches such as those of Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania, he said, we did not come here to talk about unity or to remind ourselves how unity is important. We have come here to affirm the fact that without unity, Africa is never going to realize their potential. And one can go on to the speeches of Modibo and others and Haile Selassie and others, but it's not important to rehash those speeches because they can be located in libraries. But it's important to isolate one speech, the speech of Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, because that, for those of you who are French speakers, that was the pièce de résistance. It was the speech that, in my view, captured the essence of what was meant to be Africa. And the three things that stand out in the speech and therefore form the three-legged stool upon which my presentation will now be founded. He said that Africa must unite and unite immediately before the leaders who are present in that forum become used to the trappings of power. You and me know that they have now become victims of the trappings. He said that we must unite and come out of that arrangement with one army, with one currency, with one united country, because the former colonial powers had yet devised another method of controlling African. And he said that that thing which we later examined and recognized as neocolonialism was alive and well. And he said, if we did not do so, Africa will never realize our potential. That is the Africa about which you want me to reminisce in order for me to determine what was the vision of the founding fathers. Their vision was a united Africa. Their vision was an Africa that was united in our diversity. Their vision was an Africa that would tell her story. Their vision was an Africa that would exploit our resources for our benefit. Their vision was an Africa that would sit at the dinner table of human civilization, not as food to be consumed or as a waiter, but as a diner to enjoy the goodies of life. That was their vision. But the question is, that vision that saw Africa liberate herself from the clutches of colonialism, was it merely flag independence, as Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, not in so many words, in his book Decolonizing the Mind? Was it a total liberation of the peoples of Africa? In his famous television program, Kenya's Ali Mazrui, the program titled Africa, A Triple Heritage, Ali Mazrui says passionately and eloquently at once that Africa is the only continent on earth that consumes that which it does not produce and produces that which it does not consume. And he says, curiously, we are the only continent on earth that is still referred to in the following derogatory terms: Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, and those who are generous even refer to some part of Africa as Arabophone Africa. He says they do not say that of Latin America, they do not say that of Asia. And if you doubt Ali Mazrui, there is now a war that is going on in the Cameroons and is characterized as a war between the Francophones and the Anglophones. But if you go to the so-called Anglophone area, no more than 5% can speak eloquent French. Yet there are many ethnicities in that part of the world. And I'm submitting to us that this is important because it demonstrates that there is something in our minds that we have yet to liberate ourselves. We have yet to decolonize our mind, which Ngugi wa Thiong'o says is a prerequisite to our total liberation so that we can engage with the world meaningfully. You know, As I speak to you now, there are 54 recognized independent African countries, particularly if you talk to the Moroccans. But when you liberate yourself from Morocco, there are 55 because of Sahrawi. But I'll be of good manners. I'll say there are 54 recognized and 55 with one unrecognized. That Africa is an Africa that ought to be governed by the vision of the founding fathers. That vision was articulated in the Charter of the Organization of African Unity. One can say that the Charter of the Organization of African Unity did form the foundation stone upon which we liberated all countries, and that these countries were liberated up until 1994 or 1990 with the death of apartheid regime. The question is that vision alive? The question is that vision relevant today, particularly when we talk about freedom and good governance? The question is that vision alive for those of us who are spiritually and religiously inclined? The question is that vision alive? Can it be predicated in the Bible? This good governance that we keep on talking about, what is it? Permit me to refer to the Bible on the assumption that you are readers of the Bible and that you are Christians of Berea, who beyond the preaching will go out and find out whether I said the things that are to be found in the Bible. You know, there are two things in the Bible that inform my engagement with you in this afternoon. One of them is actually located in the Bible, and one of them is located in the dramatization of the Bible, and you'll allow me to repeat that dramatization. The first one is the story of Korah in the Bible. This man Korah, you know what he did? He assembled 250 elders of Israel, and they confronted Moses. And they said, you know, you have made laws unto yourself that you may be a prince over us. He had, of course, poisoned the minds of everybody else. And what happened? The Bible records that they were consumed. God consumed them. Because there is no freedom outside of the law. That is the message that I gather there. And then when they grumbled again, 14,700 of them were consumed. Those of you who are readers of the Luo Bible, there is a mistake in the Luo Bible. They say 14,800. They were actually 14,700 were consumed. Even the Bible can have a mistake. I've drawn it to the attention of the Kenya Bible Society. I think it was a typographical error. But it doesn't take away the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make is that when we talk about freedom, we must remember that freedom must be in the context of good governance. And that good governance must be in the context of the individuals with certain moral values. Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere articulated it very well in the Arusha Declaration in 1967 when he said that a country must be governed by certain ideals and certain taboos. The things that you don't do and the things that you can legitimately do for the better good. So that even in the Bible, when we talk about the vision of the founding fathers, even without their having been Christians or unanimity as to whether they were picking it from Christianity, there is a sense in which there is a possibility of situating this vision in the Bible. The second element in the Bible that I want to talk about is the dramatization. The time that was allotted to me is about, but remember, I'm also consuming the time that was allotted to Professor Mwencha. So I'm in safe territory. And I'm conscious that the law of diminishing returns is operating after lunch. So I'll conclude very shortly. But the dramatization that I want to talk about before I come to the last limb of my presentation is to be found in a movie which I believe all of you ought to have seen. And if you have not seen it, please watch it. How many of you have seen the 1956 dramatization of the film The Ten Commandments as directed by Cecil B. DeMille? You haven't. If you haven't, go and watch it. And there is an interesting portion in that particular story which once again speaks to Korah and Dathan. When Moses has been on the mountain of the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, there is a grumbling downstairs, and Aaron and the sister have been made to forge unto themselves a calf as a god. And in the dramatization, before Moses comes down on the 40th day, the prophet Joshua moves to the mountain and meets Moses. And when they are in between, there is noise from down in the hill. And when there is noise, Joshua says, there is noise, there is grumbling. And Moses is recorded as saying, those are the sounds of joy and revelry. The people have rebelled against God. He is carrying the 10 tablets of the law, and according to Cecil B. DeMille, as he comes down from the mountain, there are 2 horns from his head. Kiran comes from his head. Kiran meaning horns in Hebrew. And when he comes down, Dathan confronts him and says, you have made unto yourself laws that you may become a prince over us. We have freedom. And Moses says, there is no freedom outside of the law, and those who will not live by the law shall die by the law. And that is the point that I wanted to make. That all civilizations, our founding fathers were convinced that we had to have a legal regime. And this is the basis of the constitution that we inherited from independence. But these constitutions were not homemade. And that is why you see that no sooner had we settled with this constitution than they started being disrupted. But the point I want to make before I come to the constitution is an important point about their vision. This is about a meeting that took place in Cairo, in Egypt, about the doctrine of the inviolability of the boundaries of African states. Because at independence, there were those who took the view that Africa should redraw her boundaries. Those of you who are from Cameroon will be aware what happened between Cameroon and Nigeria. You will also be aware of the events that took place in Nigeria when there was an attempt to divide the country into 3, leading ultimately to the Biafra War. Those of you who are familiar with the country that was then known as the French Sudan, now known as Mali, will know the attempt that were made at that time. Those of you who are familiar with what was called Tanganyika, which later became Tanzania, will know that fact. Those of you who are familiar with the country that was known as Northern Rhodesia and now Zambia, and the one that is now called Zimbabwe, will know that. Those of you who are familiar with the history of Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, will be aware of all these activities. So the first thing that the leaders said, whether we are Muslims or Christians or animists, as we are called by other people, we shall live in one geographical territory, because the God that we worship is a God of diversity. He's the God that says that there is no Jew nor Gentile. And it must mean, if you are addressing us in Igbo or in some Nigerian language, there is no Yoruba, no Igbo. That, I think, was the vision of the founding fathers of the day. And that is why I think that when we are going to the future, the African leaders recognize one thing, that the OAU charter as was constituted was only important up to a certain stage in the life of Africa. And that is why in the year 2013, the statutes that constituted the OAU were revisited and the African Union was created. And when the African Union was created, it was created on the assumption that if we had lost 50 years, we were now going to deal with Africa from a totally different dimension and perspective. But one must ask, what is it that had informed the leaders at that time? there were a series of things that had happened in Africa, in my view, which things informed their decision. You'll remember as early as 1960, when we had barely settled in independence, the first political assassination in Africa was the overthrow of Togo's Sylvanus Olympio. And immediately after that, the murder of Patrice Emery Lumumba in 1961. And thereafter, there was a series of coups d'etats, some of them which were being informed by religious factors. So 2013 or 1981 becomes the year, 1990 rather, becomes the year when we begin to see the re-emergence of Africa. But that is not what is important. What is important is what happens in 2013. And I'm inviting those of you who are present here to go and look at the letter that was read, the imaginary letter that is written by the then chairman of the OAU Council, the South African lady called Nkosana Dlamini Zuma. It is an imaginary letter that she writes to Kwame Nkrumah. And it is written on the basis of Agenda 2063. And she writes to Kwame Nkrumah in so many words, or rather in effect she says, that I look forward to an Africa where there will be unity amongst all African states. I look forward to an Africa where there will be a railway from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to Dakar in Senegal, where there will be communication from Suakin in Sudan to Luanda in Angola, from Cape Town to Cairo, and that where the Democratic Republic of Congo shall become the hub of industrial activity, and that East Africa shall become the hub of ICT. West Africa will be industrialized, where gas will be piped from Tanzania to West Africa, and oil piped from Nigeria to the rest of Africa, and where there'll be harmony. And if you look at the 7 pillars of Africa Agenda 2063, one of them is that the guns will be silenced by the year 2020, so that we'll no more have South Sudan. We'll no more have Central African Republic. We'll no more have the Cameroons. We'll no more have battles and wars that are predicated upon religion. But we'll have an Africa where people enjoy freedom of movement and freedom of conscience within the law. And that we shall have an Africa where people have the liberty to enjoy what it is that they are meant to enjoy. And permit me at this time to use from another civilization what I consider that Africa to be. Many of you, as I conclude, will have read these words which I repeat and refer to oftentimes. They are the words that are to be found in the American Declaration of Independence. And I think that they are important for many civilizations. That all men are born equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain alienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that it must have been, when we go back to Pixley Kaisa Kaseme, when we go back to James Emmons Kweji Ragri, when we go back to Cheikh Anta Diop, when we go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, when we go back to Marcus Garvey, when we come to 1963 and we are talking of Kwame Nkrumah, or we are talking of Sekou Touré, or Olympio, or any of the leaders, it must have been their intention that it is for these reasons that governments are instituted amongst men. And I think that is the second part of the American Declaration of Independence. It is for these reasons that governments are instituted amongst men. These are not the words of the American Declaration, these are now my words. Instituted amongst men to midwife the process of their enjoying those rights. So that any government has a divine duty to ensure that they midwife this process. And if that be the case, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I'm submitting to us that the founding fathers could see what we cannot see standing on tall trees while they were squatting. They could see them with the clarity of vision that we cannot possibly master. What could they see? They could see that in order for Africa to realize their potential, the people in Central African Republic cannot run a war that is based on the fight between Muslims and Christians, that it cannot be right. They could see that the diversity of the people in Central African Republic requires that they enjoy their diversity and they live in harmony so that people can realize their potential, so that they can indeed enjoy what God has given them on this earth. They could see that the people in Mali and Mauritania cannot conduct their affairs on the basis of religious diversity. They could see that it is important that the diversity of religion is only a celebration of God in his unfathomable ways. They could see that. They could see that indeed, even in South Sudan, they cannot conduct their affairs on the basis of religious difference. And I'm submitting to us, therefore, in a nutshell, that our leaders in 1963, when they sat, whether in West Africa or in North or in East or in South, conceived an Africa whose sons and daughters would enjoy liberty, and that they would enjoy liberty so that they would lead a fuller life here on earth, but they would have the freedom of choice to exercise their freedom, and that if governments were instituted amongst them, those governments would be trustees of power for purposes of creating an enabling environment. They could foresee that we are diverse with over 3,000 languages, and that in our diversity we could enjoy our unity. In the words of Kenya's Ali Mazrui, our diversity must not be a Tower of Babel, but it could, if we want it to be a power of Babel. They could foresee that we must recognize that we have no monopoly of wisdom or monopoly of knowledge, and it is not for us to judge, and our duty is only to fulfill our affairs. It is in this regard that I see Africa Agenda 2063 as a useful document that attempts to project into the future and to remind us that in 2063, when some of us may be alive and well, that Africa will be a continent that is respected and is not referred to in derogatory terms, whether when it is convenient we are developing, when it is not convenient we are developed, when it is convenient we are the dark continent, when it is convenient we are a rising continent, that we shall, in the words of Patrice Emery Lumumba of Congo, be in a position to tell our story, however bad that story is. That is the Africa that Kwame Nkrumah must have seen. That is the Africa that Modibo Keita must have seen. That is the Africa that Julius Kambarage Nyerere must have seen. That is the Africa that I want you to see. Even you who are sitting here as Seventh-day Adventists, those of you who are sitting here as followers of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints, those of you who are sitting here as Anglicans or Presbyterians, the truth is, we are committed to one thing: Christ of Nazareth, passion in Gethsemane, agony in Golgotha, joy on the third day. God bless you.